If you have ever had $20 to your name and a child who still believed in miracles, then you already know exactly how Daniel Reyes felt on the coldest Tuesday night of November. Stay with me until the end of this video, because what happened to Daniel over the next 12 hours will make you believe in kindness again. And if stories like this move you, hit that like button and subscribe right now, because you will not want to miss what this single dad discovers by morning. Daniel Reyes was 34 years old, and he had exactly $20.13 to his name. It was folded into a soft, worn square in the back pocket of his jeans, next to a grocery list he had written 3 days ago and never managed to finish shopping for. He stood outside the Lincoln Street laundromat in Denver, watching his breath turn to fog in the orange glow of a flickering street lamp, and he did the math in his head for the 100th time that day. $20 had to become dinner, and dinner had to become breakfast, and breakfast had to somehow stretch until Friday, when his paycheck from the warehouse would finally land in his account, assuming his hours hadn't been cut again. Inside the small apartment above the laundromat, his 7-year-old daughter, Lily, was doing her homework at the kitchen table, her tongue poking out of the corner of her mouth in fierce concentration, the way it always did when she wrote her letters. She was drawing a picture of a house with a big red door and 2 stick figures holding hands in front of it, one tall and one small. Daniel had learned not to ask who the tall figure was supposed to be. Sometimes it was him. Sometimes, he suspected, it was the mother who had left when Lily was 2, and he never had the heart to find out which. Lily's mother, Carla, had left when Lily was 2, not out of cruelty exactly, but out of a restlessness Daniel had never quite understood, and had eventually stopped trying to. She sent a birthday card most years, sometimes with a $20 bill tucked inside, sometimes with nothing but her name signed at the bottom in looping cursive. Daniel had made peace with it, the way a person makes peace with weather they can't control, not happily, but functionally, focusing his energy on the parts of Lily's life he could actually shape. He packed her lunches. He read to her every night, even on the nights his eyes burned with exhaustion after a double shift. He learned to braid hair from a video tutorial at 2 in the morning, because Lily had a school picture day, and he refused to let her go looking anything less than proud of herself. Nobody had taught him how to be a single father. He had simply decided, somewhere in the fog of those early sleepless months, that Lily would never once feel like an inconvenience, no matter what it cost him personally. 18 months earlier, Daniel had been a supervisor at a mid-sized logistics company, making decent money, with health insurance and a retirement account he actually contributed to. Then the company restructured, his position was eliminated along with 40 others, and the severance check had evaporated faster than he ever could have imagined. Rent, Lily's asthma medication, a used car that needed a new transmission. It all added up in ways that no amount of budgeting apps could fix. He had gone from supervisor to warehouse picker in the space of 4 months, grateful for any job at all, working nights so he could be home when Lily woke up for school. That Tuesday had been a bad one. His shift had been cut short because of a slowdown at the distribution center, which meant less money in an already impossibly thin week. He'd walked home instead of taking the bus to save the fare, his work boots slapping against sidewalks dusted with the season's first real frost. He passed the corner grocery, thought about the eggs and bread he needed to buy, and kept walking, because he still had one more stop to make, the laundromat, to switch a load of Lily's school clothes before they closed for the night. It was there, in the harsh fluorescent light spilling out onto the sidewalk, that he first noticed the old man. He was sitting on an overturned milk crate near the laundromat's side entrance, pressed into the narrow gap between the building and a chain-link fence, as if trying to disappear into the brick itself. He wore a thin gray coat that had clearly been meant for a milder climate, and his hands, when Daniel looked closer, were bare and trembling, tucked beneath his armpits in a futile attempt at warmth. He looked to be in his late 70s, maybe older, with a face carved by decades of weather and worry, and pale blue eyes that stared out at the empty street as though he were watching something only he could see. Daniel almost walked past him. He would be lying if he said otherwise. He had his own crisis to manage, his own daughter to feed, his own $20 that needed to work miracles. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being poor and responsible for someone else's survival, and it makes a person very good at looking straight ahead. But something made him stop. Maybe it was the way the old man's shoulders shook. Not dramatically, just a small, private tremor, the kind of shiver a person tries to hide because they're why. Stopped expecting anyone to notice or care. "Sir," Daniel said, crouching down so he wasn't looming over him. "Are you doing okay out here?" The old man looked up, startled, as though it had been a long time since anyone had addressed him directly, rather than walking past with eyes carefully averted. "I'm fine, son," he said, in a voice that was rougher than sandpaper, but somehow still gentle. "Just resting my legs a spell. It's supposed to drop into the 20s tonight," Daniel said. "I've slept through colder," the old man replied. And something about the matter-of-fact way he said it broke Daniel's heart a little. They talked for a few minutes, not long, because Daniel's clothes were still tumbling in the dryer, and Lily was waiting upstairs. The old man said his name was Walter. He didn't offer a last name, and Daniel didn't ask. Walter mentioned, almost in passing, that he used to have a room at a boarding house across town, but the building had been sold to developers 3 months ago, and every shelter he had tried in the past week had been full. He said this without self-pity, the way a man might report the weather. Daniel got the sense that Walter had told this story to a lot of people who hadn't she gathered. Daniel thought about the $20 in his pocket. He thought about the eggs and bread he still needed for Lily's lunches. He thought about the fact that Friday was 3 long days away. And then he thought about his own father, gone now for over a decade, who used to say that you measure a man not by what he has, but by what he's willing to let go of for someone who has less. He didn't decide so much as he simply found himself doing it. He pulled the folded bill from his back pocket, his last $20, his grocery money, his emergency cushion, his everything, and pressed it into Walter's cold, trembling hand. "Get yourself something hot to eat," Daniel said. "And please, find somewhere warm tonight." Walter stared at the bill in his palm as though Daniel had handed him something impossibly large. His pale blue eyes glistened, and for a moment he seemed unable to speak. "Son," he finally managed, "you don't know what you just did." "It's not much," Daniel said, feeling suddenly embarrassed, as if he'd overstepped some boundary of decency by drawing attention to the gesture at all. "It's not about the amount," Walter said, closing his fingers around the bill. "It's about being seen. Nobody's looked at me like a person in a long time." He studied Daniel's face for a long moment, taking in the exhaustion etched into it. The too thin jacket, the worn boots. "You've got a child at home," he said. "It wasn't a question. A daughter. Lily. She's 7, and you gave me this anyway." Daniel just shrugged, because he didn't have a good answer. Only a feeling that had felt more important than his own hunger. He said goodnight, gathered his laundry, and walked upstairs to his apartment, where Lily was, waiting with her drawing finished, and 100 questions about what was for dinner. He told her they'd have breakfast for dinner, eggs, if there were any left in the fridge, and there were, just barely, along with half a loaf of bread that had started to go stale at the edges. Lily didn't complain. She never did. She thought breakfast for dinner was a fun game, and Daniel let her believe that, because the alternative was letting her see how frightened he actually was. That night, after Lily fell asleep with her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin, Daniel sat at the kitchen table and stared at his bank balance on his phone. $4.86. He didn't regret giving Walter the $20. Even in his own precarious situation, some part of him understood that Walter's night would have been unbearable without it, and his own family, however strapped, still had a roof and heat and each other. But he also allowed himself, in the privacy of that empty kitchen, to feel afraid. 3 days until payday. Half a loaf of bread. An asthma prescription that needed refilling by the weekend. He put his head in his hands and, for the first time in a long while, he let himself cry quietly, careful not to wake his daughter. The next morning arrived gray and ordinary, the kind of morning that gives no hint of what it's about to hold. Daniel walked Lily to school, kissed the top of her head at the gate, and turned to walk to the bus stop for his shift at the warehouse. It was as he passed the laundromat again that he saw a car he didn't wreck, a dark, well-kept sedan, out of place on a block more accustomed to delivery vans and rusted hatchbacks. Leaning against it was a man in a charcoal overcoat, holding a slim leather folder, glancing at his phone, and then up at the buildings as though searching for an address. "Excuse me," the man said, catching sight of Daniel. "Are you Daniel Reyes?" Daniel stopped, instantly wary in the way that anyone who has been chased by bill collectors learns to be. "Who's asking?" My name is Marcus Chen. I'm an attorney. He held out a business card and Daniel took it out of reflex more than trust. I represent the estate and current affairs of a man named Walter Hensley. Daniel blinked. Walter, the man on the milk crate? That's the one. Though I doubt you knew him by that description before last night, Marcus said, with the faint trace of a smile. Mr. Hensley asked me to come find you first thing this morning. He said you'd be walking this way around now. Daniel felt his stomach tighten with a confusion that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with disbelief. Is he okay? Did something happen to him? He's more than okay, Marcus said. Perhaps we should sit down somewhere. This isn't a 5-minute conversation, and I think you'll want to be sitting for it. They ended up at a small diner 2 blocks away, the kind with vinyl booths and a coffee pot that never seemed to run dry. Daniel's shift didn't start for another 40 minutes, and something in Marcus Chen's calm, deliberate manner told him this was worth being late for, even if it cost him. Over black coffee that he couldn't really afford but drank anyway, because it was already poured. Daniel learned the truth about Walter Hensley. Walter was not, as it turned out, simply an old man with nowhere to go. He was, until his retirement 11 years earlier, the founder and owner of Hensley Cabinetry and Millwork, a custom furniture company that had, at its peak, supplied fine woodwork to hotels and government buildings across 3 states. He had built the company from a one-man garage operation into something worth several $million before selling it to a national furniture conglomerate. He had a modest but comfortable retirement, a house in the suburbs, and, until 4 years ago, a wife named Ruth and a son named Peter. Then everything had unraveled with a speed that no spreadsheet could have predicted. Ruth passed away from a sudden stroke. 14 months later, Peter, his only child, 41 years old, a father himself, died in a tuner highway accident on his way home from visiting Walter for the weekend. Walter, who had spent his whole life building things meant to last, watched his entire family disappear within a single grieving season. He sold the house, unable to bear its silence. He gave away most of his savings to a foundation established in his son, Sably name for children who had lost a parent, keeping only enough, he thought, to see him through his final years modestly. But grief does strange things to a person's judgment, and a series of bad decisions, a predatory financial advisor, an ill-considered investment, a boarding house that folded out from under him, had eaten through what remained faster than he had planned for. He could have called any number of old business associates, Marcus explained, people who owed him favors, people who would have written a check without blinking. He refused. He said if he was going to find out whether the world still had any goodness left in it, he wanted to find out honestly, not by cashing in on who he used to be. For the past several weeks, Marcus explained, Walter had been quietly observing the people who passed him on the street, not out of desperation alone, but almost as a private experiment born from grief. He wanted to know if a stranger, with nothing to gain, would still choose kindness. Dozens of people had walked past him without a glance. A few had tossed spare change without ever making eye contact. Only one person had crouched down to his level, asked his name, and given him something that clearly cost him something real. He wants to help you, Marcus said, not out of pity, out of respect. He told me this morning, that young man gave me his last $20 and didn't even ask my last name. I want to know what a person like that could do with a real chance. Daniel sat in the vinyl booth, coffee going cold in front of him, feeling as though the floor of his ordinary life had quietly shifted beneath him. What does he want to do? He finally asked. Marcus explained. Walter, despite his diminished circumstances, still retained a controlling stake in the charitable foundation established in his son Peter's memory. A foundation with a mission to support single parents rebuilding their lives after financial hardship. Walter wanted to personally sponsor Daniel, cover 3 months of rent while Daniel trained, at Walter's own former company, for a position in their custom furniture division, where Walter still had enough goodwill from decades of craftsmanship to guarantee an interview and, if Daniel proved capable, a genuine apprenticeship with real wages and benefits. It would not be charity in the sense of a handout. It would be an investment, with expectations of hard work attached, the same expectations Walter had once placed on himself in that one-man garage decades ago. Why me? Daniel asked, though some part of him already understood. Because you didn't know who he was, Marcus said simply. That's the whole point. Daniel sat with that answer for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in slow circles on the table. Part of him wanted to say yes on the spot, to grab this rope being thrown to him without a second thought. But another part of him, the part shaped by a year and a half of disappointment, warehouse shifts, and promises from companies that had turned out to be worth nothing, held back. I need to be honest with you, he told Marcus. I've had people offer me things before that sounded too good to be true, and they usually were. I have a daughter. I can afford to chase something that falls apart in 3 months and leaves us worse off than before. Marcus nodded, unoffended, and slid a folder across the table containing the actual apprenticeship terms, the wage schedule, and the rental assistance agreement, all spelled out in plain language rather than the vague promises Daniel had learned to distrust. Mr. Hensley expected you to say exactly that, Marcus said. He told me this morning that a man who hesitates to believe in an easy miracle is precisely the kind of man he wants working under his name. Take the folder home. Read every line. Ask a lawyer of your own if you want one. There's no rush, and there's no obligation. It was that offer, the freedom to say no, the total absence of pressure, that finally convinced Daniel more than anything else could have. He read the folder twice that night after Lily fell asleep, then called his cousin, a paralegal in Colorado Springs, and had her look it over the following morning. When she called back and told him it was legitimate, generous even by the standards of formal internship programs, Daniel sat on the edge of his bed and allowed himself, for the first time in a long while, to cry from something other than fear. Daniel went to the warehouse that day and worked his shift in a daze, replaying the conversation over and over, half convinced he had imagined it. That evening, he went to see Walter himself, not at a milk crate this time, but at a modest, extended-stay motel room that Marcus had arranged and paid for that very morning, the first indoor bed Walter had slept in for over a week. Walter looked different already, Daniel thought. Not younger, exactly, but less like a man bracing against the world, and more like a man who had, for the first time in a long while, allowed himself to hope. You didn't have to do any of this, Daniel told him, sitting across a small table in the motel room. Neither did you, Walter said. That's rather the point of the whole thing, isn't it? Over the following weeks, the story unfolded in ways that felt, to Daniel, almost too good to hold on to without flinching. He began an apprenticeship at what was now called Hensley Marsh Fine Woodworking, learning under craftsmen who had trained directly under Walter decades earlier. The work was hard, precise, demanding, humbling in the way that mastering any real skill demands humility, but it paid a living wage, offered health insurance, and gave Daniel something he hadn't felt in a long time, the sense that he was building towards something rather than simply surviving until the next paycheck. Walter, for his part, insisted on visiting the workshop twice a week, not as an owner looking over shoulders, but as an old man who had missed the smell of sawdust and saw the particular satisfaction of watching a plain plank of wood become something with purpose. It was not, however, a straight and easy climb. There was a lead craftsman at the shop named Robert Ostrowski, a stern man who had worked under Stoller for over 20 years and who made no secret of his skepticism toward the new apprentice, who had, in his words, wandered in off the sidewalk into a job most people wait years to earn. For the first month, Robert assigned Daniel the most tedious tasks in the shop, sanding, sweeping, restocking hardware bins, and watched, arms crossed, for any sign that Daniel would complain or quit. Daniel did neither. He showed up early, stayed late without being asked, and studied the grain of wood scraps on his move. Requiem prediction, whether lunch breaks, like a man cramming for an exam that mattered more than any test he's lunch, taken in school. One afternoon, 3 weeks in, Daniel ruined an expensive piece of walnut veneer through an honest, first-timer's mistake, misjudging the pressure of a router pass. He fully expected to be sent home, possibly for good. Instead, he walked straight to Robert's workbench, laid the ruined piece down, and said plainly, "I did this. I want to understand exactly what I did wrong so I never do it again." Robert studied him for a long moment, then picked up the ruined veneer, turned it over in his weathered hands and said, "Most men your age would have hidden this in the scrap bin and hoped nobody noticed." From that day on, something between them shifted. Robert began teaching him properly, not just tasks, but technique, patience, the quiet pride of a joint cut so precisely it needed no nails at all. Walter noticed the change too, on one of his twice-weekly visits, watching from the doorway of the workshop as Daniel guided a plane along a cedar board with a steadiness that hadn't been there 2 months earlier. "He reminds me of myself at that age," Walter told Robert quietly. "Not the skill, not yet, the refusal to look away from a mistake." Robert, who was not an easy man to impress, only grunted in agreement, which from him was practically a standing ovation. Lily and Walter became unlikely friends. On weekends, Walter would sit at the kitchen table in the small apartment above the laundromat, a smaller and more crowded space than any he had lived in for 40 years, and let Lily help him sketch furniture designs on napkins, her crayon houses evolving slowly into crooked but earnest drawings of chairs and tables. She called him Mr. Walter for the first few visits, then simply Walter, and by the third month she had taken to greeting him at the door with both arms flung wide, as though he were an uncle she had known her whole life, rather than a stranger her father had met on a milk crate. Walter, for his part, began keeping a small tin of butterscotch candies in his coat pocket, specifically for her visits, and pretended every single time that he had forgotten they were there, letting her discover them with theatrical delight. One Saturday afternoon, Lily asked him, with the blunt curiosity only a 7-year-old can get away with, whether he had any children of his own. Walter was quiet for a moment, turning a butter knife over in his hands as though it required his full concentration. "I had a son," he finally said. "His name was Peter. He would have liked you very much." Lily considered this with the gravity children sometimes bring to subjects adults tiptoe around. "Where is he now?" she asked. "He died," Walter said simply, because he had decided long ago that children deserved honesty, dressed in gentleness, not evasion dressed as protection. Lily nodded slowly, then reached over and patted his hand the way she had seen her father comfort her after a nightmare. "You can be sad about it here," she told him. "This kitchen is a good place to be sad." Walter told Daniel later that night, once Lily was asleep, that it was the truest thing anyone had said to him in 4 years, and that a 7-year-old girl with a crayon-drawn house had done more for his grief in one afternoon than a year of well-meaning condolence cards ever had. Walter told Daniel once, quietly, that being in that cramped apartment, listening to a child's laughter over a kitchen table, felt more like home than the empty house he had sold after Ruth and Peter passed. "Grief," he said, "doesn't disappear, but it can learn to share a room with joy again, if you let it." 6 months after that cold November night, Daniel signed a lease on a 2-bedroom apartment across town, the first place Lily had ever had her own room in. He kept working at the shop, kept improving, and eventually was offered a permanent position, overseeing quality control for custom orders. A title that, unlike his old corporate one, he had built with his own 2 hands rather than inherited by circumstance. He never forgot where it started, and he never let himself believe the story was really about money at all. It was about a moment on a freezing sidewalk, when he had almost kept walking, and chose not to. Walter passed away peacefully 2 years later, in his sleep, in a small but comfortable home he had bought near Daniel and Lily's new apartment, close enough that Lily used to ride her bike over on weekends to show him her school drawings. In his will, he left a modest trust for Lily's education, and a letter for Daniel that Daniel kept folded in his wallet for the rest of his life, in the exact spot where a $20 bill once used to sit. The letter said, in Walter's careful, old-fashioned handwriting, that the truest wealth a man could have was never measured in what sat in his bank account, but in whether a stranger, with nothing obvious to gain, would still choose to kneel down beside him on a cold night and ask his name. Daniel Reyes still tells that story to anyone who will listen, not to boast about a stroke of extraordinary luck, but because he believes, with everything in him, that kindness given without the expectation of return has a way of finding its way back around, not always in the form of a lawyer waiting outside a laundromat with a business card, but always, in some form, eventually. He tells Lily, now growing into a thoughtful, generous young girl who still keeps a drawing of a house with a red door pinned above her bed, that the world will constantly hand her reasons to walk past people who are struggling. And he tells her that the moment you stop walking, the moment you crouch down and simply ask if someone is okay, is the moment that everything, for them, and sometimes for you too, quietly begins to change. If this story moved you even a little, that's exactly why we make these videos. To remind each other that small acts of kindness still matter in a world that so often convinces us otherwise. If you believe that too, make sure you're subscribed. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and share this video with someone who could use a reminder tonight that giving your last $20 away has never once made a good man poorer in the ways that actually count.